I live alone in a small one-story house in a quiet neighbourhood. It's the kind of place where nothing really ever happens, where people leave doors unlocked during the day and kids ride bikes up and down the street until dusk. Being a petite 20-year-old, I've always felt safe here, but after what happened last year, I don't think I'll ever feel safe in my own house again. It started with a text message. I was lying on my couch scrolling through my phone after dinner when I got a notification from an unknown number. The message was simple. Hello. At first I thought maybe it was a wrong number or a spam message, so I ignored it. A few minutes later, another text came through. How are you? Still nothing alarming, just someone being friendly. Maybe someone I knew had changed their number and forgot to tell me. Sorry, who is this? I replied. No response. I shrugged it off and went back to scrolling. Half an hour later my phone buzzed again. You should step outside for a minute. The night air is really nice. A weird request, but not necessarily threatening. I assumed it was some random guy trying to start a conversation in the weirdest way possible. I'm good, thanks, I replied, hoping they'd take the hint. A few seconds later, I really think you should go outside for a bit, trust me. Now my stomach dropped. Who was this, and why were they so insistent? I didn't respond. Instead, I put my phone on silent and tried to ignore it. But after a few minutes, another text came in. It's rude to ignore people, you know. That one made my skin crawl. I blocked the number, turned off my phone, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just some creep playing a prank, that I was overreacting. But then it got worse. The next day was normal. I went to work and ran some errands and didn't think much about the texts. By the time I got home that evening, I'd almost forgotten about them, until I turned my phone back on. The blocked number had somehow sent me more messages. I didn't like that you blocked me. You really shouldn't do things like that. Go outside. I stared at my phone, heart pounding. The messages had been sent throughout the day. That meant this person had been texting me while I was at work. They knew I wasn't home. I wanted to ignore it, but something about the tone of the messages made my stomach twist in a way that I couldn't explain. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some kind of spam bot that had found its way around my block. Then another message came through. A picture of my house, taken from across the street. I froze. My hands felt numb as I stared at the image. It was dark out now, but the picture had clearly been taken during the day, when the sun was still up. I stood up slowly and walked to my front window, peeking through the blinds. The street outside was empty. No parked cars, no movement. But I felt watched. Another message. Come outside, just for a second. I turned my phone off again. I spent that night locked in my bedroom, barely sleeping, every little creak in the house making my heart race. By morning, I had convinced myself that it was just somebody messing with me, someone who had gotten a little bored and would move on. I was wrong. The next night I was in my kitchen washing the dishes when my phone buzzed. I hesitated before looking at it. Another unknown number. Don't ignore me, it said. I let out a shaky breath and typed back. Who the hell are you? Leave me alone or I'm calling the police. A minute passed, and then, you won't call the police. Another message, this time a video. My heart pounded as I opened it. It was a short clip, just a few seconds long. It showed my house, at that exact moment. The camera panned slightly as the person holding the phone walked towards my front door. My breath caught in my throat. I bolted to the front window and peeked outside, but I didn't see anybody. My fingers trembled as I typed. I'm calling the police. No response. And then, a loud bang at the front door. I screamed and stumbled backwards. Another bang, and then another. The door shook in its frame. I ran. I ran straight upstairs to the bathroom, locked the door and crouched in the bathtub, trying to steady my breathing. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered immediately. I think somebody's trying to break into my house, I whispered. The operator's voice was calm. Where are you located? I gave my address, trying to stay quiet, trying to breathe not too loudly. Do you see the person? No, they're outside my front door. They were messaging me, they sent me weird videos. Please, send somebody now. I have officers on the way, stay on the line with me. Downstairs everything went silent. The banging had stopped. The operator kept talking to me, but I barely heard her. My heart was hammering so loudly in my chest that I could hardly think. I stayed in the bathtub, gripping my phone with white knuckles, until finally I heard the sound of police sirens outside. The officers found my front door wide open. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken, but there were muddy boot prints in my hallway. They led from the front door to the base of my staircase and then back outside. The officers searched the area, but they found nothing. No sign of who had been there, no footprints leading away from the house, just the ones inside. I showed them the messages, the pictures, the videos. They took my phone as evidence and said that they would look into it and that they'd let me know if they found anything. But I never heard back. I never got an answer. The messages stopped after that night. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted, they never came back. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed and the house is completely silent, I swear I can still feel it. That feeling of being watched. I've been hunting my whole life. My dad taught me when I was a kid, and over the years it became more than just a hobby. It was a way of life. There's something about the solitude of the woods that I've always loved. No distractions, no noise, just you in the wilderness. But after what happened a few years ago at my family's hunting cabin, I don't think I'll ever go back. The cabin sits deep in the forests of Montana, miles away from the nearest paved roads. It's small, just one room with a wood stove, a bed and a little table. It's nothing fancy, but it's been in my family as long as I can remember. I'd spend countless hours and nights alone there with nothing but my rifle and the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. But one weekend in late November, something happened that I still can't explain. I arrived at the cabin early in the afternoon. The air was crisp and the first snowfall of the season had just begun to dust the ground. I parked my truck at the end of a trailhead and hiked in. When I arrived, I immediately got the stove going to warm the place up. A couple of hours later, after unpacking my gear and loading my rifle, I decided to head out for a quick evening walk before it got too dark. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I don't mean the usual quiet you expect from the wilderness. This was different. There were no birds, no rustling of branches, not even the distant scurrying of small animals. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath. I ignored it and moved deeper into the woods, tracking the deer trails in the snow. But every now and then, I felt something I couldn't shake. The feeling like I was being watched. I've had my fair share of run-ins with wildlife before, but this feeling of being watched felt different. It felt more intentional. As the sun started to set, I decided to head back, and that's when I heard it. A thud. A solid, unmistakable thud against the side of my cabin. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse spiking. Then another. Thud. Thud. It sounded like rocks, big ones, being thrown at the cabin. I picked up my pace, my rifle raised as I moved through the trees. The moment I stepped into the clearing in front of my cabin, everything went silent. The cabin stood there, dark and lifeless. Nothing out of place, except for a few large rocks sitting in the snow near the wall. I knelt down slightly and scanned the tree line, my breath visible in the cold air. There was nothing. No footprints, no movement. Now I'm a big guy and I had my rifle, but I felt vulnerable. I felt the overwhelming urge to get into the cabin where I could at least create some sort of barricade or defensive position against whatever I believed was out there with me. I ran up to the cabin and locked the door behind me before loading my sidearm. Then I stood there silently listening, my ears ringing as blood surged through them, my heart racing. I let a few minutes pass before I began moving again. I ate my dinner, keeping the sidearm close, and every so often I'd glance out the window, half expecting to see something staring back at me, but the rest of the night was quiet. The next morning I stepped outside to fetch some more firewood, and immediately noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were tracks. They were very odd, large, human-shaped tracks, but off. The stride was too long and the steps were erratic, looping around the cabin, almost circling it. I followed them a few yards into the woods, but then they split. One set of tracks became 2, then 3, then 4. It was like whatever made them had suddenly multiplied. I stood there confused, my breath coming in slow, uneasy puffs in the cold morning air. The tracks continued in different directions, weaving through the trees before disappearing deeper into the woods. I'm not ashamed to admit, but the fear overtook me, and I turned back. I wasn't about to follow those tracks alone. Instead, I hiked back to my truck and drove into town, where I met up with my friends Tom and Kobe. We'd hunted together for years, and if anybody would believe me, it was them. After explaining the situation, they agreed to come with me. I think they were half expecting to debunk what I'd seen, and were looking forward to joking around at my expense. "Are you sure they just weren't some drifter messing with you?" Kobe asked, loading his rifle into the back of my truck. "I don't know, man," I said. "They split, like literally one set of footprints turned into 4. Tom frowned. "That doesn't make any sense." "Exactly," I replied. After grabbing the last gear, we drove back to the forest and hiked to the cabin, arriving just before noon. The tracks were still there, just as before. At this point, both Tom and Kobe agreed that they were weird. We crammed into the cabin and stood around my table and concocted a plan. We would each take a different path, following separate trails deeper into the woods, but always remain in earshot and regroup every 10 minutes. Whatever was out there, we didn't want to be alone when we found it. Hours passed and the forest remained as silent and as imposing as it had the previous day. We all felt the same sense of dread that came with the oppressive quiet. It wasn't right. In a forest this size, you always expect to hear wildlife. But today, for some reason, the forest was holding its breath, as if the forest itself knew something sinister was out there. As before, the tracks kept splitting over and over. One set turned into 2, then those 2 diverged into 4, then more. By late afternoon, we had no idea how many we were following. 10, more? It didn't add up. No animal, no person moves like that. Feeling tired and hungry, we decided to regroup and finish our search. It was then, as the sun dipped below the treetops, the silence was lifted. We heard banging, like branches knocking against trees repeatedly. We froze silently, looking at each other, terrified in amazement. Then we began to hear the unmistakable sound of brush snapping underfoot in the distance. We were all experienced hunters and had never experienced anything like this before. We continued to stand there, mouths open, frozen with fear, straining to hear if the sound was coming closer towards us. It was. And then we saw them, dark shapes, moving, far ahead. Just beyond the thick brush, they shifted between the trees, tall, too tall to be normal. Their movements were unnatural. We froze. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears as we stood there staring. Tom whispered, "What the hell is that?" None of us had an answer. With my hand, I motioned Tom and Kobe to crouch down. Whatever those shapes were, we didn't want to be seen. By now my heart felt like it was going to explode from my chest. I began asking myself why I had been so stupid as to suggest that we all come out and follow the tracks. The figures stopped and didn't move towards us any further. Instead, they just existed in the distance, swaying slightly, shifting through the shadows. They were still too far away to make out any real features, but close enough to know that they couldn't have been human. I pulled up my rifle, not to shoot, I was too terrified for that, but to use the scope as best as I could to get a clearer view. It wasn't easy, but I could clearly make out 5 humanoid shapes. They almost looked naked, but not naked. I can't explain it. They were completely dark. What terrified me the most was their size and breadth. I can't believe I'm writing this, I sound insane, but they weren't people. I don't know what I saw. I know this sounds even crazier, but the big one, I'm sure I could make out a face, staring at us. I don't think it realised we'd spotted it though. And then almost as quickly as they appeared, the big one signalled to the others and they disappeared. It wasn't like they ran, or ducked behind trees. They were just gone, like the forest swallowed them whole. None of us spoke. We were in shock. We had no way to describe what we'd all just seen. Without words, we all just turned and started back towards the cabin, walking fast, rifles at the ready. The whole way back we kept looking over our shoulders, expecting to see those shapes again, but we didn't. The moment we reached the cabin, we packed our gear and left. None of us wanted to spend another moment out there. The drive back to town was silent. We never went back. The once inviting forest never felt the same to any of us after that. I've mentioned this story to my family, and they say that they believe me, but deep down I know they don't. They don't believe what we saw was anything other than a result of exertion and dehydration. To this day, I myself have no explanation for what we saw, and since then I've never gone hunting without at least my rifle and my sidearm. I don't know if they were people, I don't know if they were something else, but I know one thing for sure. Something was out there watching us, and they don't want to be found. Every summer, my friend Jacob and I would take a week off work, pack our gear and head out to some remote part of Pennsylvania to hike and camp. We loved the solitude, the adventure, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the outside world. This particular summer, we set our sights on Sproul State Forest, a vast rugged expanse of dense woods, winding rivers and endless hiking trails. It was the perfect place to escape from everything, or so we thought. The first day was everything we hoped for. The sun was shining, the air was warm but not oppressive, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. We followed a winding trail deep into the woods, taking our time, talking about everything and anything. At one point, we stopped by a creek to refill our water bottles. I remember looking around and feeling completely at peace. The forest stretched over forever, just endless green in every direction. It was perfect. No people, no distractions, just us and the wild. At least that's what we thought. Things started to take a turn that night when we set up camp in a small clearing not too far from the trail. We built a fire, cooked up some food, and then just sat there listening to the sounds of the forest as the sun dipped below the trees. Everything felt normal, until it didn't. It must have been around 1 AM when I woke up. The fire had burned down to the embers and everything was silent. Too silent. This was unusual for a forest. Usually you hear the odd sounds of creatures and insects, but that night there was no sound. And then I heard it, a snap, and then another, and another. And then what sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the undergrowth just beyond our camp. I shot up in my sleeping bag as my heart started pounding. At first I thought it might be an animal, a deer maybe, but as I listened closer I realised it wasn't. It was something with 2 legs. It must have been a person. I turned my head slightly and saw that Jacob was awake too. His eyes were wide in the dim light, staring at me. We sat there staring at each other, frozen in fear and dread at what we were hearing. We barely breathed. The footsteps circled our camp, slow and measured, like someone was deliberately trying to freak us out. Jacob muttered to me, "What the hell is that?" I replied, "It must be a person." Then, after what felt like an eternity of the footsteps circling the camp, they faded off into the distance. We didn't sleep for hours after that. Instead, paranoia took over and we discussed for hours what it could have been and why somebody would just circle our camp. At sunrise we packed up quickly. We had a choice to make. Hike back to the car and call it quits, or press on and not let some creep ruin a trip that we'd spent most of the spring planning for. "We came all this way," Jacob said, slinging his pack over his shoulder. "I say we keep going." I wasn't thrilled about it, but I agreed. This was our trip and I didn't want it ruined. Still, something felt off as we hiked that day. The woods didn't feel as inviting as they had before. Every so often I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone or something was behind us. I can't describe it, it just felt like there was an atmosphere of malice. Like I said, the forest, it just didn't feel wholesome. We didn't speak much as we trudged along the trail. The previous night had ruined our mood and we were both on edge. At one point Jacob stopped in his tracks, throwing an arm out to block me from walking ahead. Cautiously I whispered, "What is it?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, as a breeze gently rustled some leaves, he squinted at something on the mountainside in the distance. Then he leaned in close and murmured, "I think I just saw something reflect. Something like binoculars." My stomach dropped. "Are you sure?" He hesitated. "Pretty sure. The sun hit them just right." I didn't question him. Jacob was a former Eagle Scout and knew what he was talking about. This was one of the reasons I felt safe camping with him. We stood there for what felt like forever, listening. The woods were quiet, the occasional chirp of birds breaking the silence. Then Jacob exhaled sharply. "Screw it, let's go, let's keep moving." We picked up the pace, but that feeling of being watched, it never left us. The next night, we decided to camp far off the trail, deeper into the woods, hoping that whoever or whatever was out there wouldn't find us. We set up camp as the sun dipped below the treetops. The night was still and humid, the kind of stillness where even the smallest sound carries for miles. As we cooked and ate dinner, our spirits lifted somewhat. Satiated, we began reminiscing on the past like we normally do on these trips. And with this, the vibe lifted, and after a few more tales and anecdotes, we crawled clumsily back into our tent to get some rest. We had a long walk planned for tomorrow. And then, just like the night before, I awoke. The noises, they'd started again. I couldn't believe it. We'd set up far from the trail, and made sure that we were stealthy about it. At first it was the occasional twig snap, then footsteps, but this time they weren't just circling the camp, they were closing in. Jacob and I sat up in our tents listening. The footsteps moved in different directions, like multiple people shifting around us. Then came the whispers, low, hushed voices, too quiet to make out the words, but loud enough to know that they were there. They surrounded the camp. Jacob and I sat there frozen with fear, wide-eyed, clutching our knives. Neither of us said a word, we just listened. The whispers continued, moving around us, rising and falling, like the speakers were shifting positions. Then I heard something different, not a whisper, a breath, right outside the tent. My blood turned to ice. I wanted to scream, to run, but I forced myself to stay still. I could feel something just beyond the thin layer of fabric. Jacob's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "They're right outside." I couldn't respond, I just clenched my knife tighter and waited. The whispers continued until the early hours of the morning, then just as before, they faded and disappeared. At first light, Jacob and I emerged from our tent, shaking from exhaustion. To our surprise and relief, the woods around us looked completely normal. Strangely, there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had even been there at all. And then I noticed something that made my hair stand on end, and a feeling of sickness lurch in my stomach. Something was inscribed in the mud. It looked to be a symbol of a demonic eye within an eye. The only way I can describe it is as the Eye of Sauron from Lord of the Rings. Underneath was written the words, Immer Vaksam. We didn't know what it meant, so we noted it down. I freaked out. "This isn't right, we need to leave," I urged, expecting pushback from Jacob. But there wasn't any. "Right, let's get our gear and get out of here. This is getting dangerous," he replied. We didn't speak much after. We just packed up and started hiking back with a pace that couldn't belie our fear. The hike back should have taken 2 days, but we did it in one. At one point we stopped to rest. Jacob took a long drink from his water bottle before speaking up for the first time in hours. "We're being followed." I didn't respond, but I knew he was right. By the time we reached the car, we were exhausted. As we loaded our packs, I took one last look at the tree line, and that's when I saw them. Several figures unmoving, watching us. They looked to be a mix of male and female, but the odd thing was that they appeared to be wearing odd clothing, as though it was designed to conceal their true appearance. Before I could react, though, they stepped back into the darkness, and without taking our eyes off them, we felt our way back into the car. Jacob and I never went back to Sproul State Forest after that, and I don't think we ever will. After doing some research, I later found out that the inscription in the mud was written in German, and it read, "Always watchful."